Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to be showing you how I built this super simple balance board, DIY balance board, whatever you want to call it, out of plywood and walnut. These walnut inlays right here, see? This is a great project for those of you who like to surf. If you need to practice your balancing skills, you can use this when there's no swell in the water. So stay tuned and we'll get started with the build soon. For those of you who have not hit that subscribe button, do it now. Right there. Right there. And follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And watch my other videos. The first step in this project was to take the template that I downloaded from the 3x3 custom YouTube channel website. Tamar posted a really great video on how to build a balance board with this template. I'll leave a link in the description below for the plans. Thank you for these free templates, Tamar. After that, I took a piece of plywood that I had laying around in the shop and I marked out the first side, or the first half of the board with the template. Then I flipped the template over and marked out the other side. After that, I clamped the workpiece to my work surface and used my jigsaw to cut out the board. Once the board had been cut down, I used a straight edge and a couple different rulers to mark out the middle of the board and then a couple different measurements up the length of the board. These measurements would be used later on to put the straight edge that I'd be using to do the inlays into the face of the board. There's probably a few different ways that you could do this, but essentially what I did is I used my larger DeWalt router and I figured out that the middle of the router to the edge was 3 inches. So then I marked out 3 inches from the spots where I would want to be routering out for the inlays, and then I could use a straight edge, a straight piece of plywood, and clamp it to the work surface lined up with those lines, and then do a nice clean cut with the router. Before making the cuts with my router, I pulled out these tough-built sawhorses that are super nifty and set up an area where I could do the cutting. But then I realized that the markings that I had done were not completely correct. They weren't 3 inches, they were 2 inches. So I had to do just a few more lines before getting to the cutting. After that, I used a couple squeeze clamps to attach the straight edge pieces of plywood to the board.
Yeah, and then I'll introduce him to my best friend. Clamp number 1!
You will notice that I am clamping 2 separate pieces of plywood that serve as the straight edge for the router. The second piece is actually more of a stop block for the router so that it stops at the correct part within the board. Once the inlay sections had been cut out, I set up my table saw with a feather board and got to cutting the pieces of walnut that would be inlaid into the top of the board. When you're doing really tight cuts like this, a feather board makes it a lot more accurate and safer. Once I had 2 pieces of walnut that fit into the grooves, I took it over the work surface and put them into each of the grooves, used a pencil to mark out where they needed to be cut, and then cut them with my miter saw off camera. I used a chisel and hammer to clean up some of the corners. And I used some wood glue and started filling in the grooves and then hammering in the different pieces of walnut. I used some extra glue and sawdust to fill in some of the gaps. Once everything had dried overnight, I used a straight edge bit on my router to cut off the ends of the walnut. Then I used a little hand block plane to clean up the top of the board. And then I took a round over bit, a quarter round bit on my router, and rounded over the edges. From there I started the sanding process, and I used a really low grit paper to start off, and then I slowly moved up to a higher grit. Before moving on to the oiling process, I used just a bit of plastic wood to fill in a couple more of the gaps that were left over from my not so perfect cuts. After that, I sprayed the entire board down with some water so that the grain of the wood would be raised, and then I sanded it down again. This helps get a smoother surface. From there, I mixed some pure raw linseed oil with just a bit of mineral spirits to thin it down, and then I rubbed it into the board. Now, as I was rubbing this oil into the board, I realized that I hadn't put the stop blocks on the underside of the board to help with learning how to balance. So I ended up coming back to that the next day. And to start this off, I took just a couple pieces of scrap plywood and cut 4 separate little pieces that would end up being attached to the underside of the board. Once these 4 pieces of plywood had been sanded down, I went over to the underside of the board and I attached the 4 pieces of plywood with screws and no glue so that in the future I could remove them if I wanted to. These 4 pieces of plywood act as stopping blocks on the underside of the board so that when you're actually balancing on some type of rolling cylinder like the foam roller that I'm using, I'll put a link in the description below, but these ensure that the board doesn't completely roll away from the cylinder that you're balancing on, and they really do help out a lot. And if you put 4 separate ones like this, then you can switch the way that you're balancing on top of the board, whether that be a long way or from side to side. Once those had been attached, I went on to putting one more coat of oil on the entire surface of the board. After that, the board was complete. This is so embarrassing.
You got it.
All right. Hey guys. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son.